The electric vehicle showdown. How Europe's trade war with China could reshape the global auto industry. The global automotive landscape is undergoing a transformation unlike anything we've witnessed in over a century. At the heart of this revolution stands an escalating trade conflict that could determine which economies will dominate the future of transportation. On one side, we have the European Union, home to some of the world's most iconic car brands. On the other, China has emerged as an unexpected powerhouse in electric vehicle manufacturing. What's unfolding between these two economic giants isn't just about cars. It's a battle for technological supremacy, economic influence, and the future of sustainable mobility. The global automotive landscape is undergoing a transformation unlike anything we've witnessed in over a century. At the heart of this revolution stands an escalating trade conflict that could determine which economies will dominate the future of transportation. On one side, we have the European Union, home to some of the world's most iconic car brands. On the other, China has emerged as an unexpected powerhouse in electric vehicle manufacturing. What's unfolding between these two economic giants isn't just about cars. It's a battle for technological supremacy, economic influence, and the future of sustainable mobility. The story took a dramatic turn in September 2023, when Brussels made a decision that sent shockwaves through the automotive world. After months of deliberation and political maneuvering, the European Commission announced it would launch a formal investigation into Chinese electric vehicle imports. The accusation? That Beijing was flooding European markets with artificially cheap electric cars, propped up by massive government subsidies that gave Chinese manufacturers an unfair competitive advantage. But here's where the narrative gets truly interesting. While Europe was preparing to erect trade barriers against Chinese EVs, reports emerged suggesting that EU officials were simultaneously approaching Beijing with an unusual request. Would China be willing to share its electric vehicle technology with European companies? The apparent contradiction raises a fundamental question. Is the European Union trying to protect its automotive industry, or is it simply trying to buy time while catching up to a competitor that has already raced ahead? To understand how we arrived at this moment, we need to examine the remarkable rise of Chinese electric vehicles and why they've become such a formidable force in global markets. The quiet revolution that changed everything. A decade ago, if you'd suggested that China would become the world's leading electric vehicle manufacturer, most industry experts would have dismissed the idea. Traditional automotive powerhouses like Germany, Japan, and the United States seemed unassailable. Their century of engineering expertise, established supply chains, and powerful brands appeared insurmountable. Yet China saw an opportunity that others missed. While legacy automakers were still heavily invested in perfecting internal combustion engines, Chinese policymakers and entrepreneurs recognized that the transition to electric vehicles represented a once-in-a-generation chance to leapfrog established competitors. The Chinese government poured enormous resources into battery technology research, charging infrastructure, and consumer incentives. Domestic manufacturers like BYD, NIO, and XPeng received substantial support to develop their capabilities. The strategy worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Today, China doesn't just participate in the electric vehicle market, it dominates it. In 2023 alone, Chinese consumers purchased 8.87 million electric vehicles, representing an astounding 63% of global sales. To put that figure in perspective, it's more than triple the entire European market, which sold approximately 2 million EVs during the same period. But China's ambitions extend far beyond its domestic market. Chinese manufacturers have set their sights on Europe, a region with wealthy consumers, strict environmental regulations, and a growing appetite for electric mobility. The numbers tell a story of rapid expansion that has alarmed European policymakers. In 2022, China exported roughly 300,000 electric vehicles to European markets, capturing about 12% of total sales. Just 1 year later, in 2023, that figure exploded to 640,000 units, a staggering 40% market share. Perhaps even more striking than the volume is the revenue these exports generated. Chinese electric vehicles sold in Europe brought in approximately $20.4 billion, accounting for more than half of all Chinese automotive revenue in the European market. These aren't bargain basement vehicles struggling to find buyers. They're increasingly sophisticated products that European consumers are choosing over domestic alternatives. This rapid market penetration didn't happen by accident. Chinese manufacturers leveraged several key advantages. Lower manufacturing costs, particularly in battery production where China controls much of the global supply chain, allowed them to offer competitive pricing without sacrificing features. Many Chinese EVs come equipped with advanced technology, sophisticated driver assistance systems, large touchscreen interfaces, and over-the-air software updates, at price points that European manufacturers struggle to match. Take BYD, for example. This Shenzhen-based company, which started as a battery manufacturer before moving into vehicles, has become one of the world's largest EV producers. Their models combine affordability with impressive range and modern design, making them attractive alternatives to established European brands. Similarly, companies like MG, owned by SAC Motor, Polestar, backed by Geely, and even premium brands like NIO, have found enthusiastic buyers across the continent. For European automotive executives accustomed to viewing their region as the global standard-bearer for automotive excellence, this shift represented an existential threat. The very foundation of Europe's automotive industry, built over more than a century through brands like Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Renault, and Stellantis, suddenly seemed vulnerable to disruption by relative newcomers from the East. When protection becomes policy, faced with this unprecedented challenge, European policymakers found themselves under mounting pressure from domestic automakers to take action. The automotive sector represents one of Europe's most important industries, employing millions of people directly and supporting countless more through vast supply chains. The prospect of Chinese manufacturers capturing an ever larger share of this critical market was politically unacceptable. In September 2023, the European Commission announced it would initiate an anti-subsidy investigation targeting Chinese electric vehicle imports. This type of investigation, while not uncommon in international trade, marked a significant escalation in EU-China economic relations. The formal inquiry would examine whether Chinese EV manufacturers benefited from government subsidies that distorted fair competition in European markets. Anti-subsidy investigations operate on a straightforward principle. If a government provides financial support to its domestic industries, enabling them to sell products abroad at artificially low prices, importing countries have the right to impose countervailing duties to level the playing field. These duties, essentially additional tariffs, are meant to offset the competitive advantage gained through subsidization. European officials argued that Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers received various forms of government support, direct subsidies, preferential loans, tax breaks, and other incentives that allowed them to undercut European competitors on price. According to this view, Chinese EVs weren't simply better or more affordable through superior efficiency. They were cheaper because Chinese taxpayers were effectively subsidizing their export prices. The investigation process stretched across months of detailed analysis, diplomatic negotiations, and intense lobbying from both sides. European automakers and their unions pushed hard for strong protective measures. They argued that without intervention, the flood of Chinese imports would devastate domestic production, leading to factory closures and massive job losses across the continent. Chinese officials and manufacturers countered that their success resulted from genuine innovation, massive investments in research and development, and efficient manufacturing processes, not unfair subsidies. They pointed out that Chinese companies had spent years and billions of dollars building their capabilities, and that European resistance represented protectionism disguised as concern about fair trade. After more than 6 months of investigation and negotiation, the European Union reached its decision. In a move that would officially take effect on July 4, 2024, the EU announced it would impose temporary countervailing duties on Chinese electric vehicle imports, with rates potentially reaching up to 35% for some manufacturers. This represented one of the most significant trade actions Europe had taken against Chinese products in recent years. The decision, however, revealed deep divisions within the European Union itself. Not all member states agreed on the wisdom of this approach, reflecting fundamentally different perspectives on how to respond to Chinese competition. A continent divided, France emerged as one of the strongest advocates for protective tariffs against Chinese EVs. As home to major manufacturers like Renault and Stellantis, which owns Peugeot and Citroën, France has deep economic and political interests in preserving its automotive industry. French officials argued passionately that without strong trade defense measures, their domestic manufacturers would face impossible competitive pressures, potentially leading to plant closures and significant unemployment. The French position reflected a broader philosophy favoring industrial policy and strategic autonomy. From Paris's perspective, allowing Chinese manufacturers to dominate European EV markets would create dangerous dependencies, similar to Europe's recent struggles with energy supplies from Russia. Better to protect and nurture domestic capabilities now, the argument went, even if it meant higher short-term costs for consumers. Germany, however, took a markedly different stance. As Europe's largest economy and automotive powerhouse, Germany had perhaps the most at stake in this debate. Yet German officials expressed serious reservations about aggressive trade measures against China. The reasons were both strategic and practical. German automakers, particularly Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz, have enormous investments in China, which remains the world's largest automotive market overall. These companies operate major production facilities in China, employ tens of thousands of Chinese workers, and generate billions in annual revenue from Chinese consumers. Any trade conflict risked provoking Chinese retaliation that could devastate German manufacturers' access to this crucial market. Moreover, German automotive executives privately acknowledged that in mass-market electric vehicles, Chinese manufacturers had already achieved economies of scale and cost advantages that would be extremely difficult to overcome through tariffs alone. Some German officials worried that protective measures might simply delay the inevitable while making European consumers pay higher prices, potentially slowing the transition away from fossil fuels that Europe had committed to leading. This fundamental disagreement between Europe's two most influential economies created awkward compromises. The eventual tariff structure included various rates for different manufacturers, with some companies receiving lower duties based on their level of cooperation with EU investigators. This nuanced approach reflected the political reality that Europe needed to appear decisive in protecting its industries, while avoiding measures so extreme they would trigger a full-scale trade war with one of the world's largest economies. Adding another layer of complexity, some analysts noted that the EU's investigation might have been partly coordinated with the United States. In May 2023, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo had made provocative statements suggesting that the United States might take extreme measures to ban Chinese connected vehicles from American roads, citing national security concerns about data collection and cybersecurity vulnerabilities. The timing raised questions about whether the transatlantic allies were pursuing a coordinated strategy to limit Chinese automotive exports to Western markets. If so, it would represent a significant hardening of Western economic policy toward China, moving beyond specific trade disputes toward a broader effort to contain Chinese technological and economic expansion. Perhaps the most uncomfortable aspect of Europe's anti-subsidy investigation is the rather glaring double standard it appears to represent. While EU officials criticize Chinese government support for EV manufacturers as unfair subsidization, European governments have themselves provided enormous financial assistance to their automotive and battery industries. Germany alone has committed billions of euros in subsidies for battery gigafactory construction, electric vehicle research and development programs, and consumer purchase incentives. France has offered substantial tax credits for EV buyers and financial support for domestic manufacturers transitioning to electric production. The European Union as a whole has implemented various programs designed to accelerate the automotive industry's electrification, including grants, loans, and regulatory incentives. One could argue these measures differ in structure or intent from Chinese subsidies, but the fundamental dynamic remains similar. Governments using taxpayer resources to support their domestic industries in a strategic sector. The difference, from Europe's perspective, is that when European governments provide support, they view it as necessary industrial policy. When China does the same, it becomes unfair trade distortion. This inconsistency hasn't gone unnoticed in Beijing, where Chinese officials have pointedly criticized European hypocrisy. They argue that Western countries have long used government support to build and maintain industrial advantages, and that objecting when non-Western countries employ similar strategies represents a form of economic colonialism designed to keep developing nations perpetually disadvantaged. So what will these newly imposed tariffs actually accomplish? The immediate effect is straightforward. Chinese electric vehicles exported to Europe will face additional duties potentially as high as 35%, significantly increasing their final prices for European consumers. For Chinese manufacturers, this creates a difficult calculation. They could absorb some or all of these additional costs by accepting lower profit margins, maintaining competitive pricing but reducing their overall profitability. Alternatively, they could pass the costs along to consumers, maintaining margins, but potentially losing market share as their products become less price competitive against European alternatives. The reality will likely involve a combination of both approaches, with the specific strategy varying by manufacturer and market segment. Premium brands like NIO or Polestar, which compete on technology and prestige rather than price, might find it easier to maintain their positioning despite higher costs. Mass-market brands that built their appeal primarily on value will face tougher choices. However, the impact may be less devastating than EU policymakers hope for a simple reason. Many Chinese-branded electric vehicles sold in Europe aren't actually imported from China. Several Chinese companies have acquired European brands or established European production facilities specifically to access the EU market while avoiding potential trade barriers. Consider these examples. SAIC Motor owns the MG brand, which has significant heritage as a British marque and maintains production facilities in Europe. Geely, another Chinese automotive giant, owns Volvo and has created several joint brands with European production. Even seemingly new Chinese brands often involve complex ownership structures and manufacturing arrangements that blur the lines between Chinese and European products. This means that while tariffs will certainly affect some Chinese exports, particularly those from newer manufacturers without European production capacity, the overall impact on Chinese-branded vehicle sales in Europe might be relatively modest. In the short term, the tariffs could slow Chinese market share growth and provide breathing room for European manufacturers. But as a long-term competitive strategy, trade barriers alone seem unlikely to reverse the fundamental advantages Chinese manufacturers have built in battery technology, supply chain integration, and manufacturing efficiency. Behind all the political maneuvering and trade disputes lies an uncomfortable truth that European policymakers are increasingly forced to confront. In key aspects of electric vehicle technology and infrastructure, Europe has fallen significantly behind China. The numbers paint a sobering picture. While Europe saw its EV sales grow by a respectable 28% in 2023, reaching approximately 2 million units, China's market expanded to 8.87 million vehicles, more than 4 times larger. This massive gap isn't just about market size. It reflects fundamentally different levels of commitment, investment, and execution in the transition to electric mobility. Consider the charging infrastructure challenge, which represents one of the biggest obstacles to EV adoption anywhere. In February 2023, the European Union set an ambitious goal of installing 14,000 new charging points every week to support the growing EV fleet. The target recognized that without adequate charging availability, consumers would remain hesitant to abandon conventional vehicles. Yet reality has fallen dramatically short of these ambitions. European countries are actually installing only about 2,000 new charging points weekly, less than 15% of the stated goal. This massive shortfall has created a patchwork charging network that varies wildly across the continent. Countries like the Netherlands, Germany, and France have relatively robust networks with 110,000, 80,000, and 70,000 charging points respectively. But southern and central European nations lag far behind, creating range anxiety and practical difficulties for EV owners trying to travel across borders. The distribution problem extends beyond simple numbers. Many European charging networks suffer from reliability issues, confusing payment systems that vary by operator, and insufficient fast charging capacity for long-distance travel. Stories abound of EV drivers waiting hours to access charging stations, particularly during holiday travel periods or in less developed regions. China, by contrast, has pursued charging infrastructure development with characteristic intensity. Major cities feature extensive fast charging networks, battery swap stations that can exchange a depleted battery for a fully charged one in minutes, and sophisticated mobile apps that show real-time charging availability. The Chinese government coordinated this build-out as part of its broader EV strategy, ensuring that infrastructure kept pace with vehicle adoption. This infrastructure gap reflects a broader technology deficit that worries European officials. Chinese companies have developed significant leads in battery chemistry, manufacturing efficiency, and software integration. CATL and BYD have become global leaders in battery production, while European companies struggle to establish competitive alternatives. The European Union has invested in several battery gigafactory projects, but these facilities lag years behind their Chinese counterparts in scale and cost-effectiveness. It's within this context that reports emerged of European officials approaching Chinese counterparts with an unusual proposition. Would China be willing to share its electric vehicle and charging technology with European companies, potentially helping Europe close the competitive gap? The reported European outreach to China regarding technology sharing represents a fascinating moment in international economic relations. After imposing tariffs specifically designed to limit Chinese EV imports, EU officials apparently hoped China might nonetheless provide technical assistance to help European manufacturers improve their own capabilities. The logic, from a European perspective, has a certain appeal. If Chinese manufacturers shared their battery technology, manufacturing processes, and charging infrastructure designs, European companies could accelerate their own development programs, reducing the time needed to achieve competitive parity. This technology transfer could help Europe meet its climate commitments by accelerating the transition away from fossil fuel vehicles, while also protecting European jobs and industrial capacity. For China, however, the proposition presents an obvious problem. Why would Chinese companies surrender the competitive advantages they've spent years and billions of dollars developing, particularly to competitors in a market they're actively trying to penetrate? Chinese electric vehicle and battery technologies represent the culmination of enormous investments in research and development, extensive trial and error, and strategic vision by both government and private sector leaders. Companies like BYD didn't achieve their current capabilities by accident. They resulted from sustained effort, often operating at losses for years while building expertise and scale. Moreover, China learned hard lessons from earlier periods when Western companies acquired Chinese manufacturing capacity and market access while retaining all advanced technology domestically. Chinese policymakers have been quite explicit that they view technological self-sufficiency as a strategic imperative, essential for avoiding the kind of dependencies that leave nations vulnerable to foreign pressure or sanctions. The European request for unconditional technology sharing thus seems remarkably tone-deaf given the broader context. It's difficult to imagine European companies agreeing to freely share their proprietary technologies with Chinese competitors if the situation were reversed. Why should Chinese manufacturers be held to a different standard? Some analysts have suggested the European approach reflects a deeper confusion about how to respond to China's rise as a technological power. For decades, Western nations could assume that they would maintain advantages in advanced technologies, while China specialized in lower-value manufacturing. That assumption no longer holds in many sectors, including electric vehicles, creating cognitive dissonance among policymakers who haven't adapted to this new reality. While European officials were contemplating technology-sharing requests and implementing tariffs, Beijing was preparing a response that highlighted the complex interdependencies in EU-China trade. If Europe wanted to demonstrate the economic costs of trade conflicts, China could play that game as well. In a move that sent ripples through European agricultural sectors, Chinese authorities announced they would initiate an anti-dumping investigation targeting pork and pork products imported from the European Union. On the surface, this might seem disconnected from electric vehicles, but the strategic calculation is clear hit European economic interests in areas where China has significant leverage. The numbers explain why European pork exporters reacted with alarm. China represents the world's largest pork market by a substantial margin. With more than 1.4 billion people and deep cultural traditions of pork consumption, China imports massive quantities of pork products to supplement domestic production.